Hey friends, I want to give you some support today on learning how to hold space for your emotions and self-regulation. I did upload a video which got some interest, but I had re-listened to it and I was like, I'm kind of just going off on people how about that, how they need to self-regulate versus going deeper into the tools. And so obviously if you're watching this, y'all already know you need to do that. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into some of the concepts that I was talking about and really talk about how to self-regulate, right? There's a couple key things that I was sharing in that I want to dive deeper into, and that's really going from the reactive state to the observer state to the processor state, and then you can step into a place of self-regulation, right? If we are emotionally dysregulated, right, it's because we're stuck in some kind of wounding, right? Our wounds are like this trigger that when something happens, right, in our life, we're responding based on that emotional wounded response, right? That's our reactive state. So, something had happened to you in the past, and that let's use like the example of disempowerment, right? Maybe like people speaking over you, right? Maybe you grew up in an environment where you couldn't be heard. I totally resonate with this, right? Speaking on personal experience here, right? Where you weren't heard, you had to learn. You're like been learning how to use your voice, and when people speak over you, you feel very disempowered, and it triggers this emotional response in you, right? And then you end up in this reactive place of probably like defending yourself, right? This is the wound that you're holding, right? And so this is actually the first step in recognizing how to hold space for your own emotional well-being, right? Is that you never had your emotional space held, right? And this is a big thing. Is like, yes, we need to start to connect with the right type of people who can actually hold space for us, but it's also really, really important that you learn how to do that for yourself. Like, you are always going to be your number one, right? You always are got to be your number one who can actually show up for your emotional space, right? And that's also how you can get the most support from other people, because if you can show up in communication of your emotional needs, then it's much easier to get the emotional support, right? So this really becomes the first key in stepping into observation of your experience, right? Because before, right, or if you're in this state, you're living from a place where someone speaks over you, and now you're in this reactive wound, this emotional reactive wound, and you're not feeling emotionally cared for, right? But that's where you've got to observe, and then we're going to learn how to take responsibility for our own emotional space, right? So this is why the first step is really starting to acknowledge what major triggers are coming up for you, right? And like, obviously when you go deeper down this journey, you're going to be picking it apart deeper and deeper, but you can really start with, how am I reacting in my environment? Like, every time I go somewhere, am I having this dysregulated emotional response? Why am I having that dysregulated emotional response? And often, like most of us grew up with emotionally dysregulated people. Like, that's the truth. And so a lot of times it's also just a learned behavior, right? That we've learned to be emotionally reactive rather than responding to our environment, right? That's the shift, is going from reaction to response and engagement, right? And then you choose what you do and do not interact with, and that's where you start to create healthy boundaries. And you're like, you know what, I'm not gonna engage with that. And here, and there's many different ways to create those boundaries, which we can talk a little bit more about, but I want to give you this process breakdown, right? So if you start to really look at this and say, where did this come from? Using the disempowerment example, right? Like, this came from me not being able to use my voice, or when I would speak, that being not heard, right? And so this is where you can really start to sit with the observer role, seeing yourself in this reactive state, seeing yourself responding in environments, and then you can really sit with, what, and maybe, not like in the moment, right? Like you're gonna observe in the moment, right? But then this is where you start to learn how to actually hold space for it, is that you come back to that emotional space in your own time, right? And in your own environment, you know what I mean? Like you're not gonna do this in the moment, you know what I mean? You're gonna come sit with that situation, right? And here's the big key in this, right? Because we're, like I said, we're constantly in this reaction, and this dysregulation of reaction. So we're gonna do more pausing, right? We're gonna pull back and sit with, why did I have that experience with this person, right? They really triggered me, right? So I talk about, if someone is triggering you, it's your trigger, right? It's your trigger. People are always acting absurd in the world, right? So like, you're being triggered. If you're healed in that, then you're not going to be reactive to people acting stupid. That's just how they are, right? So on your own time, this is where you begin to hold space for yourself, and you can sit with, okay, why did I feel so upset by this person's behavior? Well, they treated me like this and this and this and this. Okay. Well, where does that come from, right? And now you start to, this is the beginning of holding space for your emotional experience. Now you're the one, right? You're your own, you're the person holding this container for yourself and saying, okay, why did you have, what happened here? Where is this coming from, right? Start to ask yourself questions. And here's the big thing: get out of your brain, come into your feelings, right? Because our brain is the one who's in trigger reaction from an emotional experience, right? This is the big, big key. Get out of defense and judgment and this sort of like self-righteousness, because that's actually a defense mechanism, right? So if we can look at that and say, oh, I'm defending myself because my heart felt unheard, right? That's, now we're going deeper into our emotional experience, and now we can sit into that and we can say, oh, well, I don't really feel like people ever hold space for my voice, right? But you're only going to come to that thought through actually sitting in the emotional experience. And this is the big key I talk about of self-accountability, right? Because you're coming out of a place of blame and putting it on somebody else. This person did this that made me angry. That's the story that keeps you trapped in self-dysregulation, truly. And again, I'm not invalidating that people don't do stupid things. Absolutely they do, right? But when you have the keys to your own environment or your own internal space, you're not reacting to the environment, right? So instead of getting stuck in the loop of this person, right, we're coming back internally to say, why am I feeling this way about this person's behavior? Not why are they acting this way? Why did I have this response to their behavior? That's where you start to sit with, okay, where is this coming from? That's when you step into processing, right? This is when you become the processor of your own emotional experience. This is where you actually start to hold space for your emotional experience, right? And at first it's going to feel super foreign, it's going to feel super foreign to be like, sitting with this experience, right? And this is why in the other video that I'm remaking now, all right, I was talking about sitting in your feelings versus sitting with your feelings, right? Because many of us just sit in our feelings and we don't actually process them. And then we create storylines, blame and these people and this stuff and da 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 da, right? This is the switch when we go within and we really look at why we are having an emotional reaction to somebody's behavior, right? Or an environment, like whatever it is, right? That's happening, right? So you're starting with observing what's happening. And again, it's like when you're really in this situation, you're not gonna try to necessarily shift yourself yet. You're gonna notice yourself having a reaction to somebody, right? You're gonna notice yourself reacting to the environment. And just by consciously becoming the observer of your own experience, you begin to come out of the storyline that it's someone else's fault, right? Let me give you like a hilarious example that I think many of us resonate with is like traffic, right? Being stuck in traffic. And I was someone who was like always late. Was a habitual late person for sure. Okay. And what do we do when we're habitually late people? We're mad at everyone in traffic because we're late, right? Right? You're the one that's late. And then you're like mad, running this story, I have to get to work, this stupid person, da 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 da, like now we're running loops, if only these people, right? And it's like, well, if only you just gave yourself 15 extra minutes, then you wouldn't have showed up in this environment and been mad because there was an accident, right? And especially when this is the funny thing about it, right? Is that you're creating a whirlwind of your reality. So traffic sucks, right? Just like that people are going to do dumb things in the environment, right? Like you already know that's the truth. So you're living in your own loop of being late and then being angry, being late and then being angry, being late and then being angry, right? That's your loop, right? This is how you break the loop, is it being the observer and saying, oh, I'm the one that continues to show up late. You have to be honest with yourself. I'm the one who continues to show up late. Why am I always showing up late? Like that's a whole thing to unpack, right? We're not gonna go into that, right? But that's where it begins, is you start to unpack that, like, why am I always late? Well, this is part of the dysregulation, right? Is that you never feel in control of yourself. You always feel like sort of like this chicken with your head cut off, running around trying to like catch up with yourself, right? This is where you pause. You start to pause and you start to look at these things and you start to notice your behavior and you start to notice your engagement with the environment, right? This becomes the very important step for you to start recognizing not only your own behavior, but then to regulate yourself in your experience and the environment, and then make better choices for yourself, right? And like talking about the late example, like this was a thing that I did, right? I would always like try to put too much in, you know what I mean? Instead of giving myself time. I'm like, oh yeah, I can do this really quick. And then you're late. And it's like, stop, slow down, make space for yourself, right? That's kind of the big thing. It's like you're not making space for yourself if you're living in this reactive, dysregulated environment, right? So, and I'm using I'm using this basic example because we can all relate to it, but obviously what we're moving through usually is much deeper. Even the concept of, like I'm saying, of being late had way more to do with other emotional issues I needed to unpack, right? So this is when we really start to recognize, right? Like, well, I'm not making time for myself, and these are the things that you start to see, right? When you're really sitting in that, you're like, well, I feel like I'm rushed and I can never, I feel like I'm not where I want to be in life, right? These are the things you start to come to when you start to sit actually in that space. It's like, oh, the truth is I'm not happy and I'm rushing around and I'm this and that, and so it's coming out in these, like, in a blow up in traffic, right? So it's really important to recognize where you're defending your own storyline. And the storyline is the defense mechanism that's keeping you trapped, right? So you're observing this, and as soon as you start to notice these things, and then you start to make space there, you begin the processing. You're sitting with your emotional space. Really, that's it. Like, this is the big key. sitting with yourself. And I talk about this as like how many people can actually just sit still with themselves without pulling out their phone, without doing something, without filling the space, right? Like always having to fill the space because you're lacking something internally, right? So you're always trying to fill the space. You can't even be still with yourself, right? So that's so huge. You've got to make space to sit with yourself. Just sit there. And it's super uncomfortable, right? This is the whole thing about holding space for your own emotions, is like it's extremely uncomfortable. So we don't want to do that. We're probably having some kind of a volatile reaction just to the concept of sitting with your own feelings, right? And again, not sitting in your feelings, because that's very easy for us to just sit in our feelings and run stories and da 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 da. But to actually sit with those feelings, why am I feeling this? First of all, what am I feeling? What am I truly feeling? Why am I feeling this way? And these are the branches. And then we begin, I talk about this in the somatic processing video. If you want to check that one out, I really talk about how to connect with this into the body itself and where am I holding these emotions inside the body and start to pull those up, right? But we're looking at the branches of the tree of, I'm having this emotional reaction, but then where does it go into the tree trunk? How was I conditioned in this way? And then into the roots of where did it come from? And then we can start to hold space. And this is where inner child work is so huge, right? This is where we begin to really hold space for the versions of us that were neglected, because this is where, like I said, this is where it stems from. If your voice doesn't feel heard now, it's probably because your voice wasn't heard as a child. So there's this little version of you who's like, still not feeling heard, who's never been held emotionally, right? And so you have to be the one to go in and hold space for that version of yourself, right? You're the one who has to start by, and yeah, it is unfair. I think there's a part of us that has like this, it's like that childish energy of like, well, it should have been done for me, right? So now we're like expecting other people to take our emotional baggage because it should have been held. And you're right, it should have been. But it wasn't, and it's not someone else's responsibility to pick that up. It's yours. It is unfair, totally, right? But now you've got to come back into that emotional space of yourself and say, where was I not held emotionally, right? And where am I now going to step in and hold that space for myself? This is why it's so important. It's so important to do this instead of looking for somebody else to hold space for your emotional situation, right? Bring that within, and this is why I said it's so uncomfortable. And we want to tell stories, and we want to, like I said, we don't want to come within because it's painful. It's painful to sit in that. And so again, this is like where this observer energy comes in, is that, we're sitting with the uncomfortable experience that we're having emotionally that's deeply rooted, right? This like deeply rooted emotional experience that's never had space held for that experience, right? So, and this is where, I'm talking through this like, okay, and now but obviously like there's an emotional process to this, right? There's a good chance you're going to be crying, or, it's like if you need to create a little rage container for yourself, and just like, it's okay to have these emotional, like what you're doing is this, when I talk about a container, right? What I'm saying is that you're holding a space for the experience, right? Because the rage is coming out somewhere else, and it's leaking out onto other people. It's leaking out into the environment. So what we're going to do instead is now create a container to hold space, your own container. I'm going to hold space for my rage right now, right? And you're going to step into that, and you're going to be like, you know what? I feel like I need to, dance or write or scream. I've talked about this, like, if you need to go into the forest and scream, then do that. You know what I mean? And it's like, here's the difference is now you're doing it consciously. Now you're holding, that's what the container is. I am consciously going out to release this rage inside of me that's been held, right? Because what we've done is try to suppress it, not process the emotions, and then it blows up on somebody else, or it blows up here, right? So this is like a conscious choice to, I'm gonna go and let my inner child scream because she's angry, right? She's angry, she wants to scream, and it's like, okay, like let's create a space to do that, right? Or maybe you, like I said, maybe you just need to cry. Maybe you need to sit in the self and just hold space in your heart and cry. And you probably need to do all of these things, right? And so when you really start to be, when you want to step into a place of self-regulation, it's not like a pretty journey, right? You are gonna have to move through the emotional dysregulation you've been stuck in. And the truth is, like I'm saying, is that you're doing it in a reactive way anyways. So now we're redirecting that energy to conscious processing, right? And so if you're telling like the same story and over again, like, oh, like, I don't know, like nothing's gonna work out for me, right? That's a big one. There's like a deep worthiness wound there, right? These are big things to unpack, right? So we've got to recognize that it's a process. But when we start with like recognizing, okay, I keep telling this story. I keep telling the story that things aren't gonna work out. And you defeat yourself. You go into an environment and you're like, oh, like this, well, it's not gonna work out because of this, right? This is the story. And it may be different context, right? It may be completely different context, but you're telling the story of it's not going to work out, right? This is just an example, right? So, like I said, there's different contexts. So remove yourself from the situation. This is where we get out of the storylines. Remove yourself from this specific situation because it's not this specific situation, right? It's just another environment we're creating to work through the trigger, right? We're constantly creating an environment for us to recognize our emotional experience and then to hold space for that and to process that and then to create a different situation, right? That's how you get out of the loop, right? Recognize your story, begin the processing journey, and then you go into these deeper places, right? And this is how you step deeper into self-regulation, right? Like I said, you're not going to be able to do this. You're not going to be able to feel self-regulated at first. It's going to take you time. It's going to take you a lot of emotional processing before you get to the place of self-regulation, right? So once you really step deeper into this place where you stop telling stories about why things aren't working out for you, why it's other people's fault, why, or just even trying to get other people to hold your emotions, right? This is like stepping deeper into that place and saying, okay, I'm going to hold space for my experience, right? You're starting to process your emotional experience. The journey to self-regulation at that point becomes natural, right? You're starting to recognize where you weren't showed up for. Now you're starting to build trust with yourself. I'm going to come in and I'm going to show up for me. Where I wasn't heard, where this person didn't hear me, I'm going to hold that space, right? And you're really going to there's like a lot of emotions that are going to come up around this, right? Because even like releasing the judgment and shame towards yourself, like, oh, there I went again and I didn't use my voice. Like as soon as you become conscious, you know what I mean? You're going to create more storylines because you're like, oh my gosh, like now I'm seeing this and I'm not showing up for myself. That's an opportunity for you to start showing up for yourself, right? That's the space where you can start to say, okay, well, here's how I want to show up for myself, right? Now you're stepping deeper away from just feeling, like I said, this whirlwind of reaction in the environment to like, okay, well, what does it really look like to be self-regulated? What does that really look like to hold space for myself in an environment and use my voice? What would have I liked to say in that moment, right? And then we can also recognize like, oh, like, maybe your first response is still reactive, like, I would have liked to tell this person this, and it's like that's still, that's still part of the wound, right? Because if you're really self-regulated, again, you're not having this emotional attachment. That's what self-regulation is. You're not emotionally attached to other people's experience, right? You're releasing yourself of that, and you're coming within and you're saying, I'm in control of myself. I'm in control of my emotional state. And you can only get to that place by recognizing your emotional state, right? So that's where we really start to step into this, is when we can recognize, hold space for our own experience, process the emotions. And then the next level is that, like I said, it's a natural progression where now you start to build trust within yourself to show up for yourself in the environment, to, come from a place of response versus reaction, because you're no longer triggered. Or you may, like, here's the thing, because the trigger, like, you work out of the trigger, you recognize the emotional reaction, you start holding space for that, you start processing that, you start to release the trigger, but it's still going to come through your environment, right? And this time, you're choosing differently, right? Because you've already processed the emotion, because you've already recognized the trigger, because you've already seen this. This is when you step into the space of, like, the true regulation, where you're like, oh, I've seen this. I know what it is. I'm not going to have an emotional reaction to it. And here's how I told myself I wanted to show up for me, right? You've already worked through all this. This is what I wanted. This is how I wanted to show up empowered in the environment. And then we do it. And then we do it, right? And this really is a journey. And I'm thinking of, like, a big one for me was, like, I used to, like, be an emotional container for people dumping trauma, right? Like, I used to, like, just sit there and hold space for people just to unload their bullshit, right? And I didn't know how to create a boundary there. I didn't know how to, like, I was stuck in, like, there's, like, many conditionings in this, right? But I was, like, felt bad to create a boundary in that space because their emotional experience, I was compromising my emotional experience for somebody else's, right? And so in becoming the observer of this and wanting to respond differently, and then, like I said, you get frustrated because it keeps coming through your field, and you're, like, working through this, like, you want to respond differently and you don't know how, and then you're, like, frustrated, and, like, so I was, like, the deep learning of this, right? I remember seeing a woman, and it was the same. So I was at a store, and I was talking to this woman about something, and she just, how people, like, and they just go and go. They're not even, here's the crazy part, they're not even aware that they're in an experience with somebody else. They're just going on and on and on and on. And you're like, okay, well, it's nice to meet you, and, like, but you're not truly in that empowered space. Maybe it's just like, oh, like, in this situation, I'm like, oh, okay, like, okay, but you're still allowing this person. And this other woman had come in her power, and she had, like, a 1-minute conversation, and immediately saw this woman's behavior, right? She immediately saw the type of person that she was, and that she was just emotional trauma dumping. And so this woman, and it was so seamless. This is what I recognized. I learned, this is the thing, when we pay attention, we can learn so much, right? This woman came through, and she said, the other woman immediately started going into, like, and then as soon as this other woman came in, she had a moment, she came in and she said, she recognized her experience, right? The other woman's experience. And then she said immediately, boundary. She said, okay, and then she was like, well, it was so nice to meet you. Have a wonderful day. And then just walked off. And it seems so simple, right? But at the time, I didn't even know how to do that. I didn't even know how to do that, right? I was still like I was like still trying to exit. I was still like, okay, I have to go, you know? And and so seeing this woman behave in this way, I was like, wow, that's how it's done. You know what I mean? And so that was like, right, I'm starting to observe, I don't want to be in this environment. I'm seeing, and then I'm like seeing this example of like, okay, here's how I just cut off a situation. But here's the big thing about it, right? I had an emotional wound where I thought it was my responsibility to hold someone else's trauma, right? I felt bad about being in my power, right? So that was the wound that I had to heal. It's not like I couldn't just say the words like, oh, I have to go, bye. That wasn't the issue, right? The issue was I had an emotional experience that I was holding on to that made that my responsibility, right? So when I went into that wound and unpacked why I was holding space for other people's emotions instead of my own, right? Then I could step into my power. And then when I went into these environments where people were, and it's funny because then we get tested, right? This is what I'm saying. Once you work through it, and then you get tested out in the field, right? This is life. You learn, you have training ground, and then you go in, you got tests, you got final tests, right? And then you got initiations, right? You got the final boss, right? You know, so it's like you've got to go through a lot of layers to free yourself from this. And you have to get out of this state of like, ah, why is this happening again? Ah, like, you know what I mean? It's happening again so that you step out of it. So you step out of it. And then you can step into this place where you're like, oh, well, it's so nice to meet you. I have to go. Have a wonderful day, right? And like, when I was first stepping into that, I was still moving through the feeling of feeling bad, right? I was still moving through like, oh, there's something wrong with me for just walking out of someone's trauma dump. Like, no, absolutely not. That person was not making space for an actual conversation. They just were like I said, leaking emotions everywhere, right? So like, you know, if you're not aware of your situation or your emotional experience, you are just literally emotionally leaking and trauma dumping on people, like real talk. That's what you're doing. So this is why it's so important to go on that journey of self-discovery of your experience. And that's where the self-regulation comes from. It comes from emotional maturity. It comes from recognizing your own experience. It comes from learning to, like, that is the holding of space for yourself, is sitting with what's really going on inside. And if that's where you're feeling stuck, right? If you're feeling stuck in old storylines, or maybe you even got that far in recognition and you're just sort of like feeling disconnected or feeling dysregulated, right? I encourage you to start with just taking, 10 minutes a day, 10 minutes at night to sit with yourself and your emotional experience, right? That's where you can really start. Not only can you sit with the environment and recognizing those things, but even just making space for yourself to sit with your emotional experience, right? Consciously making time for that, and just allow whatever's coming up to come up, right? I can't tell you how many hours of just like sitting in emotional processing I've done, right? Like, it's going to start with 10 minutes, but like, that's the work. That's the work. That's holding space for yourself, is sitting with your emotional experience, not filling that space with something else. And when whatever is coming up, sitting with it. What is my emotional experience? What is happening right now? And again, like, the feeling is to want to get rid of it. The feeling is to want to like give it to somebody else, get it out of my body, get it out of my system. And like I said, it is important to physically release emotions out of the body, right? But it's going to keep coming up if you don't sit with where is it coming from, right? Because it's a continued loop that you're in. It's a cycle that you're in. And so, you've got to recognize the loop. You've got to hold space for the loop. And then you can release it from the body from the heart, from the mind, and now you create a different storyline. That's how you get out of the loop, right? But it really starts with self-awareness, and then you have to start taking those steps for yourself. And this is really where, like I said, building trust with yourself, it's so huge. This is where, you're going to recognize, oh, I've been abandoning myself. I've continued to put myself in situations. I've continued to create environments. I've continued to have these reactions, right? And so there's a deeper level there of like, I'm going to recognize and hold space for the version of myself I've been abandoning. Real talk, right? Like this is a version of myself that I keep leaving behind, And then another big thing that you can do, right? This was huge for me because I was this person. I think we're conditioned this way since very young. We're conditioned this way to wake up and stress, right? We're conditioned the second, like we have a fucking alarm. I do not fuck with alarms anymore, but like, like this is the conditioned, like, you're waking up, I have this, I have that, right? Like that's how you're stepping into the environment. Like off top, that's extremely triggering to wake up to like an emergency buzzer. You know what I mean? That's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare, right? So, maybe change, if that's your alarm, maybe change it to like a song. You know what I mean? No, but yes, but also this was a really intentional, conscious thing that I implemented was my mornings, right? I don't wake up like that anymore, right? Finding space to wake up in peace, even if you have to get up early, right? And I know, because trust me, I was this person who's like, no, I'd rather sleep for 10 extra minutes, right? You got to shift that. It's so important because if you just give yourself 10 extra minutes and you wake up, for me, like coffee, right? It's a ritual. It's a ritual because it's holding space for my peace. I wake up, I don't look at my phone, right? I wake up, I sit with myself, I make coffee, I sit in peace, I hold space for myself. Welcome to Earth. Welcome, you woke up, welcome to the Earth today, right? Just by starting to make these spaces in your life, you're making space, first of all, for yourself and for a new story. And off top, that one shift, giving yourself 10 minutes in the morning to just be present with yourself. And whatever that looks like for you, maybe you want to go sit outside for 10 minutes, right? 5 minutes. Start with whatever, right? Maybe you just want to sit in your bed for 10 minutes before you do anything, right? Just start making space for yourself. Just that one little switch is going to open a doorway for you to start making more space for your experience, right? Now, instead of waking up in reaction to your environment, right? You're like, oh, I get up, I'm late, the alarm, and this, I have to. And so the journey continues, right? Just by holding a peaceful space for yourself when you wake up, right? If you need to start with 2 minutes, do that. Before you look at your phone, give yourself 2 minutes to just be present in your own being, right? Just sit there for 2 minutes. Be present with yourself. If you're already feeling the stress, right? Because you probably are. You're already feeling the stress. Come into your heart space. Just let it go. Release it. That's like a beautiful tool to start with. And whatever these programs are running, just making space for those to be released, right? Making space for those to move, right? And so that's all they're going to do at first. It's just going to be moving and it's going to be like volatile, right? So just sit with that, right? Just sit with that. Because eventually you're going to find the peace in those 2 minutes, right? Eventually, you're going to be able to come into that space where it's peace, but that's going to take making space. That's how you hold space. You make space, right? You start with making space for yourself in your experience before jumping into this action into the environment, right? For me, I had to step deeper into gratitude, right? I had to, I really intentionally did this. I think for a year, I forced myself to wake up and be grateful. And I'm not lying to myself, right? I'm not like, I'm grateful. Like, it's not like about lying to yourself. It's about a reprogramming, right? And some days it's like, I'm really grateful for my bed right now. I'm grateful for this bed. I am grateful for this bed and this coffee, and, you're going to start there, right? Because you're probably not even feeling grateful to wake up, right? You're like, no, I'm not really feeling grateful to be alive. And that's what I'm saying. You don't need to lie to yourself, but you can find something. You can find something in that moment. I am grateful that I can sit here in this bed for this 30 seconds to a minute and just sit in that, right? And then you start to create something different. You know what? I'm grateful for this. And then you get to a place, I'm grateful for this piece. And then at a certain point, it's like, I'm not telling myself I'm grateful. I just am there, right? And so that's a total reprogramming. This becomes, again, creating the space for your experience and allowing yourself to find a different experience there, right? And then this allows you to come into yourself and out of the environmental reactive state, right? Now I'm sitting with my own experience, holding space for my experience right now. And now I'm going to start creating a new story. That's where the self-regulation truly comes in, right? And now when you enter the environment, you've already created a different engagement, right? You're not jumping out in the environment with this right? This reactive, angry, or crazy sort of energy, or like feeling all over the place, or like I said, right? The emotional dysregulation is very like you literally can't see clearly. You cannot see clearly. You're in like disarray, right? And so this action of making peace for yourself, of making space to just be present with you, that's truly where it starts. That is truly where it starts. So make space for yourself. That's how you begin to hold space for yourself. Make space for yourself to even do that, right? You got to even create the room for that shift, right? So, okay. Well, I hope this was helpful. And, I'm sure that I'll be making more videos that's going deeper into aspects of these processes. I am available for private sessions. I am currently putting together a program of emotional, mental, spiritual support. And you can work with me one-on-one, plus go through the alchemical journey of transformation. And no matter where you're at in your journey, I am here to guide and support you through that transformational process, right? And that's why I really created this program, to give a framework, but work one-on-one with people, because we're all in a different state. We all come from different environments, but the tools are the same, right? But I'll be launching that pretty soon here, probably within the next month. If you want some deeper support on truly stepping into that transformation and, stepping into this work fully and finding that peace, because that is priceless. Your peace, your peace of mind, your peace of being. And so, if you're interested in connecting into that, I'll be sharing more information. You can also send me a message, flowstatealchemy@gmail.com. If you appreciate this video, I also appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe if you're not already following me and you want to see more of my content. And you can also buy me a coffee at the link below if you appreciate what I'm creating here. And you can also check out my website. So I appreciate you being here with me and checking out my channel. And I hope this gave you some tools today to help you deepen your practice of holding space for yourself, emotional regulation. You know, you're here, and that's also a first step, right? This is you making space for your experience, right? So just always remember that, you know, it's a journey, and each step that you create and holding space for that is also the answer, right? All right. Sending you so much transformational support on your journey, okay?